Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world. And I do hope that you're exceedingly well. And we've got a lovely story for you tonight. So this comes with lots of love to each and every one of you. And don't forget to get that lovely warm cup of cocoa, because I've got a lovely story all the way from Tennessee. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Jessie and I grew up in a Tennessee mountain home in the late 50s, early 60s. We lived in a very cosy wooden cabin, made with very mature rounded wooden logs, and the cabin consisted of a kitchen, living area and one main bedroom for my parents, and two bedrooms for the girls, and one bedroom for the boys. So with so many of us living together under one roof was really quite a tight squeeze. We lived on a very small plot of land, and I grew up with 5 brothers and 8 sisters, so we were very sizable as a family, and life was exceedingly hard for us, as in those days we didn't have a great deal of money. However, we were living in America during the Eisenhower era after the end of the Second World War in 1945. At that time, many Americans saw a great deal of rising affluence that far surpassed other generations, and the economy prospered from lower taxes, balanced budgets and public spending, and it was said that America had a standard of living that no other country could even approach. However, in the rural Appalachian mountain areas and some urban parts of America, there was still a great deal of what was known as invisible poverty, where 25% of citizens suffered financially, and our family would have been included in those stats. What we lacked for in finances, we more than made up for in love, because our family was incredibly close, and we rarely looked out for each other. Our home was filled with laughter, love, humorous chatter and singing, and as my parents couldn't afford to buy us toys, the natural world invariably became our playground. And we were resourceful and industrious enough to make our own toys, like we created our own homemade catapults, and we also constructed some ingenious wire cars that we built meticulously, and they were so successful that they inspired us to become innovative in all other avenues of our lives. Growing up, my brothers and I could put our hands together to make just about anything, from a luxurious oak kitchen table for my mum to a barn-sized chicken coop for all the chickens, and a tree house that was big enough for all of us kids, that overlooked the magnificent Tennessee views of mountainous valleys and undulating countryside. As for my sisters, they also lacked for nothing. My mother was a dab hand with a sewing machine, so she would make them the most wonderful, lavish-looking dolls with their own unique, expressive little faces that were attired in perfect, rich embroidered garments, done in meticulous stitching, that were much more gorgeous than anything you could possibly buy today. She would create beautiful dolls' faces, realistic-looking hair, sumptuous, opulent clothes, and intricate detail that made my sister's dolls quite literally the envy of every single young girl in town, who would literally dream of owning one of my mother's dolls, and they were made from recycled fabrics, but to look at you would have found that impossible to believe. So having tons of money does not necessarily buy you everything, because there were a lot of rich kids that would have loved one of my mother's dolls. We raised chickens on our land and grew all our own vegetables, and we would sometimes make exchanges with other farmers, like swapping some vegetables for milk, cream, butter and cheese, and so we never really wanted for anything. I cannot say that any of us felt deprived in any way, possibly because we didn't know any better at the time, but I think with my parents' skill sets and our innovative minds, we pretty much could make anything we set our hearts on. My father worked as an odds and ends man and a jack of all trades in the local town, commuting from one job to another on the back of his mountain bike. One day he would help a neighbour tag his cows, another day he might be painting windows or refitting some kitchen cabinets. All his details were highlighted in the window of the local grocers, and surprisingly his meticulous services were always in demand by the locals. As a result, my father became one of the most well-known, much-loved characters in our local town. My mother was a stay-at-home mother who educated us, cooked for us, and managed the household with her culinary prowess and fastidious attention to detail. She excelled in absolutely everything she did. Her pantries were lined with all her hard work, canning hundreds of bottles of preserved peaches, pears, plums, marmalade, jams, chutneys, pickled vegetables, and the list goes on and on. Our family was incredibly religious, so church on Sundays was non-negotiable as far as my mother was concerned. She would literally dress us up to the nines for every single church service so that we looked incredibly smart, because arriving at church wearing everyday clothes was dishonouring God as far as my mother was concerned. She would always say that if you were having the Queen for dinner, you would present her with your finest food and dress in your grandest clothes, so it should be no different if we were entering God's holy place. She said that the Queen might be important, but God was the man that sat on the great white throne in the heavenlies, so in his presence our clothes needed to be spotless, without crease and without blemish. When things were tough, my mother would even use our old curtains to make our clothes, and her handiwork was so brilliant that we never looked like the poor bedraggled family among the townsfolk, even though we most certainly were. On the contrary, we were always among the most well-turned-out family in town. As kids, I enjoyed church on Sunday because it was an opportunity to congregate with other families and to play with kids our own age, and believe me, that was amazingly fun. Tennessee was a brilliant place to grow up for any kid, because it was so exquisitely beautiful, with towering majestic mountain ranges, rolling green valleys, and areas of resplendent green forests, rocky crags, cliffs and ridges, silvery lakes, creeks, ponds and gravel pits. You name it, we pretty much had it all. For a kid it was like being in heaven every day, because there was never an ending area of natural wilderness to explore. The first time I ever encountered a Bigfoot was when I was about only 8 years old. My brother and I had been playing at the creek, and we'd been throwing pebbles by the lake to see who could throw their pebble the furthest and make the least amount of noise in the process. I would liken it to diving championships today, where the neater and the more noiseless the plunge, the higher the score. Our game was exceedingly similar. In other words, the quietest and the furthest pebble scored the highest points. As we were playing, I do remember feeling that we were being scrutinized by a pair of unseen eyes, but as I turned around to look, I saw absolutely nothing. Suddenly, as my brother Billy continued to play, a pebble came flying past us and landed in the water far further and quieter than any of our feebler attempts had been, which made us feel very clumsy and pathetic by contrast. It would seem that some strange invisible force was playing with us, and was beating us in the process, and what's more, was cordially waiting for their turn to play with us. It was all decidedly odd, and my brother and I looked around for our mystery playmate, but once again we heard and saw absolutely nothing. After about an hour we decided to return home, and as we proceeded back on our way to our log cabin, we felt almost certain that we were being followed. Every time we walked, something would walk with us, and when we stopped, it would also stop. We did know we were being followed, but we never knew what was following us or who it was that was stalking us, but this happened to us every single time we proceeded home after playing at the creek. Every time my brother and I returned to the creek to play, we would find that something invisible would join our games, but we did not know who or what it was that interceded in our games and showed us up every time by being far superior than us in throwing pebbles from a very vast distance and in a much quieter descent in the water. One day I noticed this dark, shadowy movement moving behind a very large tree, and I ran over to the spot to see what this thing actually was. Then I saw this humanoid ape-like creature. He was about 4 foot tall, covered with long auburn hair, and he had this long brown leathery face with brown sparkling mischievous-looking eyes. I just stared at this mysterious-looking critter in sheer amazement and awe, because I had no clue what this thing was, but I knew it was the invisible creature that had been playing with us at the creek. The creature was painfully shy and immediately went to hide the moment we'd seen it, and I think it wasn't pleased to have been observed by us. I think it wanted to be our friend, but on its own terms, and it suited him to remain in the shadows. At that time my brother and I didn't know what to make of this curious, somewhat peculiar humanoid ape, but he continued to play games with us as an invisible third party, until one day the creature stopped playing with us altogether. We figured out that he must have moved away with his family, because we sensed that he was a youngling, but we did miss this invisible presence in our weekly games by the creek. When I was a young boy, I had no trouble getting to sleep. On the contrary, I was the one member of our family that slept like a baby. But as I grew older, getting to sleep became a huge challenge for me. I really don't know why. I began to suffer from the most terrible insomnia. This was a problem that did not affect any other member of my large family, and was exceedingly frustrating for me, not being able to get a good night's sleep. When my mother took me to the doctor to discuss my impediment, the doctor suggested that if I couldn't get any sleep, I should take some extra exercise in the middle of the night, and this course of action would help me physically become more exhausted, reduce my restlessness, and therefore encourage sleep. He strongly advised against any medical intervention, like sleeping pills, as he believed them to be notoriously unreliable and completely addictive. Funny enough, the doctor's advice did work superbly for me. If I was restless and could not sleep, I put on my outer boots, a sweatshirt, and armed with a flashlight and my father's Remington rifle, off I would go into the Tennessee countryside at night, without a single care in the world. I knew the layout of the land like the back of my hand, and understood all the wild animals in our neck of the woods. So should I encounter a predator like a mountain lion, a cougar, a bobcat, or even a bear in a precarious situation, I knew how to defend myself, so nothing concerned me at all about my little nightly excursions. On the contrary, they became an exciting adventure for me, and something that I began to enjoy, realizing that I was getting more out of the day than the rest of my family, with a few extra hours to burn every single day. What was there not to like? As far as I was concerned, it was win-win all the way. Suddenly my nightly excursions became experiences that bordered on the exceedingly bizarre, and the more peculiar as strange outer-worldly things began to happen to me that were beyond natural explanation. One night I was taking a walk when I saw this 3-year-old girl wearing a pretty light turquoise dress, white tights, tiny white shoes, and she had her curly blonde ringlets tied together in 2 ponytails. She was running deliberately towards the creek. My first thought was, what on earth is a little kid doing running out at this time of night? Why isn't she tucked up in bed? I realized with great trepidation that this poor little girl could potentially drown in the murky depths of the creek. "Little girl," I called, "come back! Please come back!" I cried out. But the little girl failed to respond to my desperate calls, and then to my utter dismay I watched her plummeting into the creek before my very eyes. In alarm, I immediately dived into the water, looking frantically for the girl, and then I found her, and I gathered her in my arms. She felt like a cold, limp, wet rag doll. Very suddenly things began to change, and the little girl's arms grew monstrously huge, and I found myself being deliberately yanked and hauled under the freezing cold water and submerged beneath the tangled roots that lay beneath the watery surface. Suddenly I found that I was wrestling and scuffling with a much more powerful force that was not of this world, and was certainly not a little girl. I found myself staring into the soulless, coal-black, lifeless eyes of an evil old shrew, with corpse-like waxy skin and long black hair that resembled snakes. I knew I was in the presence of evil herself. I've never been so spooked in my entire life. I was so incapacitated by a compounding hysterical fear that I could barely scream, and even though I tried to pray, the words just failed to flow from my lips. All I knew to do in that moment was to physically fight back, with all my strength and with all my might. Finally, after an exhausted, hectic struggle, she let go of me. The only way I can describe that fight was that I felt like I was wrestling a huge block of ice. I pulled myself out of the water, heaving for breath and breathing as fast as I could. I looked up and I saw the little girl in the turquoise dress. She waved at me, and then she had a malicious smirk on her face. She turned around to face the creek and fell over and descended into the watery depths all over again. I stood there watching in a horrified stupor. One thing for sure was I was not going to be diving in after her again. I suddenly saw rising from the water this smoky, misty vapour that whirled in a long funnel shape, twisted, circled and spiralled, and proceeded to morph into this hideously evil, decrepit bag, the one that had tried to drown me earlier. She was hissing, screaming at me, causing my blood to run cold. I just turned around and ran towards our cabin, hardly daring to believe what I'd actually seen. But I knew with a certainty that I had stared evil in the face that night. Shortly after that event, when family members took photographs of me, in the background you could see this little girl in a turquoise dress staring hauntingly into the picture. It was the same girl that had been seen falling into the water and transforming into that evil old hag. "What a lovely girl," my mother commented, staring at one of the photographs and studying it carefully. "I wonder who she is and why she's in all those photographs." I chose never to say a word about my bizarre experience with the ghost girl. Imagine my amazement when my mother made a doll exactly like her. I want to tell you that that doll gave me the goosebumps, as its extraordinary likeness to the little girl was absolutely haunting. My mother gave that doll to my sister Carol. My sister Carol began to complain to my mother that the little girl in the blue dress was sneaking into her bedroom at night to steal the doll. Every morning the doll would be found floating in the creek, head size down. Carol reported scratches and bruising all over her body, and on 2 occasions observing the little ghost girl morph into a hideous hag that screamed at her. All my sisters saw the horrible hag morphing from a vaporous smoke and ran to my parents' room screaming, refusing to sleep in their bedroom for many long nights. It was then that the doll became known as the haunted doll, and my mother burnt it in our fire pit and read some biblical verses, and we were never bothered by that evil hag and that little girl ever again. To this day I am certain the little girl and the hag are one and the same, and maybe they ended up haunting that doll as well. On another nightly excursion of mine, I encountered an entire family of Bigfoot. Of course, at the time I had no idea they were Bigfoot, but now I do. They looked a lot like auburn-haired Bigfoot who had taken part in our pebble-throwing games when I was only 8 years old. But these creatures were exceedingly different in appearance, so maybe you do get different species of Bigfoots. These Bigfoots were covered in long, shaggy brown hair, and they towered like long, lofty, dark, shadowy giants under the dusky firmament. One of the Bigfoots was 11 foot tall and easily 1,000 pounds. The other 2 were only 8 feet tall and significantly smaller. I was curious and excited to see them, so I followed them to make sure that I had not been spotted. No prizes for guessing where they were going in the dead of night. It was to that creek. What was it about that creek, I wondered, that attracted so much nefarious activity? The Bigfoot family all went for a nightly swim in the creek, and they were not unlike humans playing in a swimming pool, the way that they were splashing around in the water. They were chattering to each other excitedly in the strange monkey-like language, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, and backwards and forwards to each other. It truly sounded like they were really engaged in a very expressive, interesting dialogue, where I noticed they used their hands for gestures and facial contortions to express themselves. Every time they were happy about something, they would make a low whooping sound that sounded like whoop, whoop, and even when they were chatting, a whoop would crop up in their conversation when something was pleasing to them. The creatures could swim under the water for a very long time, sometimes swimming 2 lengths without coming up for air, which I thought was incredible. They all swam like otters, manoeuvring their bodies through the water seamlessly. I was hiding very close to the creek, lying down on some high turf behind a rocky ridge that gave me an excellent view. I was lucky because there was a glistening full pearly moon and hundreds of jewel-like silvery stars, so the soft illumination made the light on this night quite remarkable. The Bigfoot played a very similar game in the water to our Marco Polo, but they were throwing a small block of wood to each other in the water and running to catch it, and never once did they miss, as humans invariably always do. I was astounded and somewhat envious of their masterful dexterity, agility, swiftfulness and grace. Every time they caught the block of wood, especially if it bounded towards them in a peculiar angle, they would make a happy whooping sound once they actually caught it. Sometimes I noticed they intentionally threw the block at a very difficult angle, hoping that it would be impossible to retrieve. But for these critters, their swift nimbleness was off the charts, and invariably they never ever missed. One of the smaller 8-foot creatures swam under the water for a very long time, and came up holding a monstrously huge catfish in its hands that was wobbling violently and desperately trying to wiggle away to freedom. The Bigfoot thrashed the fish against its large torso and killed it instantly. He proceeded to catch another 2 catfish in this peculiar way, and then all 3 of the Bigfoot climbed out of the creek, shaking their hair like wet, shaggy dogs, and water went absolutely everywhere. I watched them sitting by the creek, tearing the fish meat off the bones and tucking into it. As they ate, they were silent for a very long time, and no one said a word. All you could hear was the jaws chomping. But once they'd finished eating, the excitable chatter began all over again, and I noticed that Bigfoots love to chat. They started to examine each other's coats, looking for nits or fleas, and it appeared to look like a strange kind of grooming was in process. If they found a tick or a flea, they would simply pop it into their mouth and gobble it up. They would run their nimble fingers through each other's long, shaggy coats, trying to brush away some of those knots and tangles, some that seemed beyond help, because they were so tangled they would be impossible to remove without a pair of scissors. But these creatures would literally tear off that matted tangle with their hands and throw it into the creek. Once they'd finished grooming themselves, I watched them gliding into the woods on their long, agile legs, and they were magnificent to watch. They were moving with such grace and fluidity. I would ask my father what these strange hairy humanoids were, because sometimes even during the day you might catch a glimpse of one of them very briefly, but most of the time we never saw them, because they were very secretive, elusive, nocturnal creatures. My father referred to them as the woodfolk, and he told us that they liked to be left alone, and we were to respect their privacy. If we came across angled branches in the wood, we were told to leave those areas alone, as those were keep-out points made by the creatures. He told us if we failed to respect those boundary points, those gentle creatures could turn on us and become exceedingly angry. He told us it would be like we were waging war against them. There was a large tree in Tennessee known as the hanging tree, and when we were growing up it was situated on some public-owned land, and it had two names engraved on the trunk. One was Steve and the other was John. This fascinated us a lot as kids, and we also put our names on that tree trunk. One day I asked my father all about that hanging tree, and he told us that in 1920 it was rumoured that a farmer had hung two young men on the tree because they had stolen his prize bull, and he was incandescent with rage, and even though he got his bull back, the young men promised him restitution by working on his farm for over a month without any pay. Once they had paid their debt back to the duplicitous farmer, he deviously proceeded to hang the two terrified young men on the tree, because he believed they deserved to be punished for what they'd done, even though he had got his bull back. One of the horrified farmhands reported what he'd seen to all the townsfolk, but without the bodies ever being recovered, no one in the town believed the boys, and they couldn't prove anything, so he got away with it. They were reported to be ghostly sightings after that of two ghosts of the two young men that had been spotted hanging on that tree. I'd always believed those stories to be hocus-pocus and just legendly, but when I saw the boys hanging there myself, I began to think very differently. On this occasion I was riding my mountain bike during the night. It must have been about 2 o'clock in the morning when I heard a very violent snapping sound. I looked up at the tree and I saw the ghostly forms swinging from the branches of a tree of two young men. I watched them for a second and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The next minute they were gone. I suppose it gives credence to the strange story, and there must be truth to it. So there you are. That's my story. I just want to thank you so much for that extraordinary story about your life in Tennessee, how industrious your family was, the incredible dolls that your mother made that were the envy of everyone. Even rich folk would have loved to have had dolls like that. So it does show you that money doesn't buy everything. And it does sound like you had the most incredible, envious life that many people would only dream of, and surrounded by such incredible beauty. And to have such amazing encounters with Bigfoot, I mean, twice in a row, once when you're 8 years old, the second when you're a little bit older, a whole family of Bigfoot, watching them swim and eat fish. And then to have those ghostly encounters too. It is incredible, but it does appear that the Appalachian area is alive with supernatural activity. Sightings of dogman, sightings of Bigfoot, sightings of ghostly apparitions. It is quite incredible what goes on in the Appalachian mountain area. Until next time, goodbye and good night.